Hi, everyone. We're going to speak into this microphone so the video can hear us. I'm Thomas G. Roberts. This is Kaitlyn Johnson, my colleague. We're from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a nonpartisan think tank downtown. We're part of their Aerospace security program. And we focus on issues in the air and space domain. And we're here to talk about a study that we did last year and this year. It took about 12 months that asked the question, what does space deterrence look like? How can we use what we learned from nuclear deterrence theory to apply it to the new space domain, what we call the second space age? So today I'm going to spend a bit of time sort of defining that second space age, comparing it to the first one, establishing that definition, and laying the framework for what space threats there are in this new domain, in the second space age. How do they compare to what was there before, and how are they unique and new? And then Kaitlyn will take it over, and she'll describe traditional deterrence theory, how it relates to nuclear deterrence. And then something special at the end is that we created a tabletop exercise, a war game to actually test out some of these issues. What would happen if you were confronted with an event where a conflict could escalate to the space domain, which would be for the first time. That's never happened in the real world. We've never seen a battle in space. And so Kaitlyn will talk about more about that at the end, but it's a special edition we have to the report, and we're excited about it. So here I have a chart of all space launches since the beginning of the space age. From the first time humans launched a satellite in 1957, it was the Soviets launching Sputnik 1. And as you can see, at the very beginning of the space age, say from 1957 to 1966, the US and the Soviet Union were absolutely dominant in the space launch environment. The US launched over 60% of satellites. The Soviet Union launched about 30%. And the remaining were broken up between other countries. It was mostly France and Italy. But the other space players were only fringe efforts. The majority of the environment was completely occupied by two nations. And so it was a bipolar environment. And Kaitlyn would later take advantage of that to compare it to the nuclear environment at the time. All the way until about 1990, these two countries continue to dominate. And we drew a line at 1990. It's not the first time that's been divided, calling the first part of the space age from 1957 to 1990 and the second space age 1990 to now. A couple important things happened then. One of them that you can sort of see from this chart is that the Russian launch rate drops off. And that can likely be attributed to geopolitical effects on the Earth. So the collapse of the Soviet Union. But also it's the rise of the commercial space market. Before 1990, only 4% of satellites in space were commercial. And it's a bit harder to define what does commercial mean, but what we're saying is that over half of the satellite is paid for by a private company, not a federal government and not a military. And that can be blurry when you look at other countries. And our analysis, of course, looked at a large number of Chinese satellites, and this issue is also quite blurry for Southeast Asia. But what's interesting about after 1990 is that the growth of non-US, non-Russian players became exponential. You can sort of see that here. So all the way between 1990 and today, that top portion of the chart, countries that are not the US and not the Soviet Union or Russia, Russia inherited over 70% of the space infrastructure of the Soviet Union after its collapse, grew exponentially. And that's quite impressive. And there are large players in that group as well. China, the European Union and its partner states, India, Japan, and the few others mostly partner with one of these larger organizations to get their satellites into space to pay for space launches. So some of the defining characteristics of this second space age are some of the things I've already described, but we like to divide them in what we call our 4 Ds. One is that it's more diverse. There are more countries at play and more commercial satellites. Okay, thanks for the scroll help, Kaitlyn. It's more disruptive. Who are these commercial players and how are they different? I love talking about space issues with audiences outside of CSIS and outside of the space community because we know about a lot of these places. SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, these are billionaire-backed startups. They're individuals who want to make a difference in the space domain. That is a new issue. The cost of access to space is extremely high still, but it's lower than it used to be in the first space age. And so you have individuals who can create companies from scratch and get there themselves. And it's disordered. So when there were only 2 countries operating, that's not entirely true, that's an overstatement, but there were about 2 countries operating the first space age, treaties were a bit easier to manage. You didn't need as many of them. The mostly military satellites in space, over 70% of the satellites in space were military related at the time, were related to our nuclear infrastructure. And standard nuclear deterrence locked the United States and the Soviet Union into escalating into the space domain. And so we didn't need these treaties that are missing now. And some people argue that we need to revamp them immediately before the creation of perhaps a US Space Corps or other space forces around the world. And the last D is that it's dangerous. As we've been developing our technology in the space domain, we can do so much with an individual satellite, more than we could ever do in the first space age. That makes these targets what we call juicy to potential adversaries, where one knockout could affect a system in a greater way than it previously could. It's also dangerous because, and I'll talk about this in greater detail in a moment, the number of ways to counteract assets in space is growing. What can people do to take out our assets in space? It's a major risk for the second space age, and it's something that was a smaller issue in the first space age. So I'm gonna break that down. So, and I said that there are threats against our space systems. I mean that there are things that adversaries can do to limit the benefit we get from our assets in space. We divided them into 4 categories. And one is kinetic physical. And that means that there's a kinetic effect on the satellite itself. It means we are destroying it, and the satellite cannot perform its functions because it is no longer intact. The second is non-kinetic physical, which means we're not touching it, but we're physically damaging or degrading the on-orbit systems. Electronic means where the potential adversary is perhaps tampering with the signal that the satellite deploys. And cyber is perhaps one of the most interesting ways to threaten the space system, and that's by editing the data that is sent from it or to it, or perhaps even hijacking the satellite and bringing it into your own control. And that last one's actually quite scary, and I'll talk about that when we get to this chart. So what's interesting here, this is the way we analyze these space threats. We recognize that it's complex, and I'm not going to go through this whole matrix with you guys. Don't worry about it. But we wanted to show you that it's not just how do we respond to a nuclear attack. The comparison between a space threat and a nuclear threat falls apart when we understand the complexity of threats against space systems. So this is a large array of possible attacks that could happen against space threats, and some of these things have already happened. Some things have never happened before in the unclassified domain. If they've happened, we don't know about them. And this is obviously an unclassified report. So that first category I said was kinetic physical. So this one has absolutely happened. This is people sending a missile up to outer space to knock out a satellite. So a popular example is anti-satellite weapons, or ASATs. You'll hear a lot of that word in these conversations. And that is a missile designed to either directly ascent and strike a satellite in orbit, destroy it, or to launch a satellite into orbit. This is a co-orbital ASAT. To link up with a satellite in orbit and detonate either a conventional or a nuclear warhead in its vicinity to destroy the asset. And that's happened. The first time was in 1962, and the last time was in 2007 when the Chinese military launched an ASAT at a defunct weather satellite, and it was a big issue for a number of reasons, but one of which is that it created thousands of pieces of both traceable and untraceable pieces of debris that could damage other satellites in similar orbits. And that satellite was in low Earth orbit, which is the most popular orbit. The next category is non-kinetic physical, and that's using a high-powered laser or a high-powered microwave to damage a satellite from afar. So this could be a system that's on the ground pointing a laser up at a satellite, degrading its solar arrays and making it dehydrate, like has no power to continue its operations. Or it can be from another satellite also in orbit. The third category is a bit more difficult to understand. Electronic attacks could be jamming or spoofing. I was reminded earlier that in the movie Spaceballs, people do attempt to jam a satellite, but in the real world, it's a bit different than in the movie Spaceballs. They used a can of jelly to smear a satellite and cover it so it could no longer operate. Jamming is tempering with the signal that a satellite deploys in real life. And a cyber attack has also something that's happened before. There's several different kinds, and the one I want to draw your attention to is sort of hijacking a satellite system. So other satellites are in orbit, and they tend to govern themselves. You can control a satellite. You can tell it to move from one orbit to another, to deploy a system, to perform an action. In 2008, hackers of unknown identity hijacked a NASA satellite for twice, once for 2 minutes and once for 9 minutes. They didn't do anything in that time, but what they could have done is quite troubling. They could deorbit a satellite, they could expend all of its fuel, rendering it useless, so it could no longer move, it could no longer respond to a threat, and it can't change orbits. And they could perform a number of other actions. In that particular case, it was a scientific satellite, so I think their options were limited. Okay, so I want to turn it over to my colleague, Kaitlyn, who's going to talk about how we can consider these threats in a basis that is so different, the nuclear domain. Thank you, Kaitlyn.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm going to assume a basic level of understanding on what deterrence is, but a quick way to describe it is the cost-benefit analysis of attacking someone, where the aggressor weighs that cost-benefit analysis and what decision they make if they decide to attack you. And to deter is that you as the deterrer are trying to alter the analysis so that the costs will outweigh the benefits to the attacker. Like Thomas said, you see this all the time. You talked about in nuclear theory, and so that's kind of the first link to the nuclear domain, is that deterrence was established really with the development of nuclear weapons. And so we kind of find that there are three really big foundations to deterrence theory. The first being capability. In order to convince any aggressor that you are able to deter its attack, or you are able to respond in kind, you have to have a capability. You have to have a weapon of some sort, or be able to impose economic sanctions to deter them. These capabilities can be what we call vertical. Let's say the aggressor wants to aerial bombardment over New York City. Well, we know that the United States has a great Air Force and can do the same. So that's vertical capabilities, is when you use the same domain or the same type of capability to respond in kind, higher, lower. You're going up and down the same scale. Horizontal deterrence or horizontal capabilities are, let's say they bomb New York. Well, we could go back with a different type of capability, maybe a nuclear weapon, maybe using our Navy, or a ground incursion. So that's horizontal, is when you're spreading it across the different domains: air, land, sea, cyber, space, nuclear. And so having all those capabilities is really the basis of your deterrence. You have to show that you have this capability to make that threat against a different country so that you deter them from attacking you. The next is credibility. You have to be credible. They have to believe you have this capability, and they have to believe that you will use it. I think one great example that I jump to when I talk and think about credibility and deterrence is the Obama administration drawing that line in the sand in Syria a few years ago, that if the Syrian government used more chemical weapons on their people, we would respond. We would respond hard. Obviously, that's not what happened. We lost credibility. The aggressor, the Syrian government did not believe and did not think our threat was credible. So that really impinged on that cost-benefit analysis and lowered our deterrence against that attack. Credibility is also the willingness. That's what you see. It's not just having the weapon itself, but having the political power and the might to do so, and standing behind your word. Lastly, and maybe most critical, is communication. It's telling the aggressor, we will attack in this way, or communicating through other means like demonstrations. In the nuclear, in the arms race, to demonstrate you had a certain capability and kind of communicate that to one another, they demonstrated that capability. They tested their hydrogen bombs and different variants of nuclear weapons, their different missiles, and nuclear submarines. So there are multiple ways to communicate. Now, communication gets hard across the world. You know, it can be impinged by language barriers, by cultures, by self-bias. You see a lot of issues with communication and deterrence right now between President Trump and the North Korean government. And so that communication is really hostile, and it's also impacting and dependent upon our credibility as a nation and our capabilities as a nation, and as the same with them. Like I said, the deterrence theory really was created and founded on nuclear deterrence. And so in the 1950s, the main deterrence theory was massive retaliation. Like the first space age, the United States and the USSR were the two primary nuclear powers. We were developing a lot of capabilities, a lot of numbers. Our nuclear weapons got stronger as we continued testing them, but the first theory was, let's just make a bunch of them. And then we will have lots of nuclear weapons to deter, because if they knock out one part of the United States that had some nuclear weapons, we'll have some others on a different part. Or we'll have the triad, which is the way nuclear weapons are deployed. You have the ICBMs in the ground out in Iowa and Montana. You have the B-52 bombers, the B-2 bombers, and then you have nuclear submarines. So there's that wide variation, and with that came the theory of flexible response. So as nuclear capabilities proliferated and there were more ways to deploy these weapons, we had to find different ways than just having a lot of them to respond to. It's parallel with the space age, because as the space age has progressed into the second space age, technology has proliferated. We're not just talking about state actors anymore, we're talking about non-state actors. Commercial companies are active in space, schools are active in space, terrorists can, aggressive non-state actors can act in space. This kind of connects with, there are more challenges in space to deter, or there are more difficulties to deterrence in space. There are a lot more nuances. Nuclear weapons are a little black and white, right? You either deploy one, or you drop one, or that's about it. Space, you've got multiple different weapons, as Thomas showed. You have multiple different capabilities between communications and GPS and imaging and nuclear command and control. There's a variety of assets that can be attacked. So countries must have good attribution capabilities in space. They need to know who is attacking them. What satellites are in their area. And this is really difficult because you might not know what those satellites do, or countries might say they're just their weather satellite. They could be totally something else. It really depends on if you believe what they're saying or not, and your own intelligence and services. So the United States has pretty good attribution services, space situational awareness, best in the world. But in order for deterrence, you have to know who's attacking you to be able to deter them. Reversibility is something that's in the space domain that is not in the nuclear domain. You cannot reverse a nuclear attack. You can reverse a space attack. The difference being, I always think of is dazzling versus blinding a satellite. Dazzling is I'm temporarily blinding you, but as soon as I remove the laser that is blinding the satellite, you can operate again. Blinding is you have then completely damaged the imagery sensors beyond repair, and they cannot function anymore. So reversibility is very important and is a different nuance in deterrence than in nuclear theory. Resilience, like Thomas said, a lot. Right now, the United States has what we like to call juicy targets. So we'll send up really large satellites that have a lot of capabilities on this one satellite. That makes a really great target if someone wants to take out a lot of systems at once. So the United States should really focus on, policymakers should focus on diversifying these capabilities to multiple satellites, or another way to increase resiliency would be to be able to quickly replace if they were damaged, or to reach out to our allies or our commercial industry and use their assets to subsidize when we lose ours, and to kind of have that replacement and balance. And that's actually something we saw in our tabletop exercise. That was really interesting. Thresholds are also different in space. Thresholds being the red lines in the sand, where the United States and other countries are finding issues with gray zone conflict right now. You know, China and Russia are operating in areas that aren't necessarily black and white, military, civilian. This is very easy to do in space because a lot of other countries don't separate their commercial space assets from their government space assets. There's also only one current threshold, I think in space, and that is do not host a nuclear weapon in space. Do not put it in orbit. And that is the only real rule that all countries around the world follow. So far, like Thomas said, we haven't had a war in space. No one really knows what that'll look like, if that threshold will be crossed. But to have good deterrence, you have to identify your thresholds as a country and communicate them well so that other countries know what lines not to cross if they're looking to tamper with systems or test their own abilities. Lastly, there's an asymmetry in space for the United States in particular. The United States has the most space capabilities, but we're also the most reliant. We use them every day. We use GPS. We used it to walk over here so we didn't get lost. We use GPS in the military, protected communications between sat phones, internet, everything. It's really growing, and the fact that we have the most and we use it the most means that we are also the most vulnerable. And you have to factor that into your deterrence calculation because it might mean a lot more to us to protect our systems than it would for others. Others might be willing to take more of a loss to gain something. And the United States needs to weigh that into their calculation of deterrence, that even though maybe we would think we wouldn't attack somebody else's satellite because if they did that to us, it could be a huge loss. They might not have that same calculation and think, well, if we lose this one, that's all right. We weren't as dependent on it. It is more important for us to take out the United States' assets. So we could have just ended this report here and with all of that information, but we decided to kind of test this out on space and national security experts. So we held kind of a war game tabletop exercise over a day and a half with 3 different scenarios, 4 different teams. These were seasoned experts from across the country and across the world who came to play out this game with us. And they were split up into 4 teams, yellow, blue, orange, and red. Their capabilities, which are shown here, are both conventional and space and nuclear capabilities. And they are very varied. And so we had, a very strong, robust nation in yellow, a close adversary in blue, and then orange and red were really less capable. And that definitely impacted the way they played the game. So the first scenario we run was inadvertent escalation by an accident. So we set them up there was an accident in the area. You can see this blue helicopter was shot down. It ran into a drone because their jamming messed up their signals, and that's where the teams took over. And it was really interesting to see that how the teams communicated this information. Some had private information that others didn't, and how they reacted to one another. At the very beginning, there was a call from 2 different teams at different times to create a code of conduct or norms in space, norms of behavior. And although it was brought up, no one else jumped on it. And I don't know if that was because the game was short and fast moving, or if because they felt it was a little fruitless, that there's no way they were going to get everyone to agree, and maybe they didn't want themselves to be held to somebody else's code or norms. In scenario 2, same kind of thing, just a different way of presenting the problem. So it was also inadvertent escalation into space, but from a miscalculation. So there was a blue terrorist attack on orange, and orange called in its ally of yellow to come help it out, and the yellow helicopter was shot down on the blue side of the border. There was also a little more activity in space where 2 or 3 inspection satellites that were originally thought to be orbital debris started moving, and so started maneuvering themselves towards yellow satellites, which is really interesting because it's a theory that other countries may be developing this kind of technology where there are pieces of debris in space that are just dormant satellites that could one day be activated and move close to US satellites or other countries' satellites to attack them or jam them or steal their information. And watching that conflict was interesting. And even though that's their command and control satellites for their nuclear weapons. So that was a really big deal for them because that's a pretty serious satellite to interfere with. Nothing happened other than pretty much that. The teams were really hesitant to go into space. They escalated a lot more horizontally on the ground, bringing in their militaries to supplement or reverting to cyber attacks on each other's assets instead of direct kinetic or physical confrontation in space. The third and final scenario, we set them up to where there was advert escalation in space. So the advert escalation was that blue tried to dazzle yellow satellites, so they tried to temporarily blind them, and in doing so, accidentally completely blinded them. No other team knew this other than yellow because it was their satellites. And at the end of the game, yellow still had control enough over their satellites to maneuver them and crash them into blue satellites. That was the only in-space kinetic, and it was a last resort. It was a last move, hoping to really stop them and shut them down. But overall, we're going to move to the findings. But what was really interesting was that these teams, they rather to escalate horizontally than vertically. So even though there were space actions to start with, and we forced these space actions in them with the background, they de-escalated from space and escalated elsewhere through their conventional forces or through cyber attacks, economic sanctions. One team hacked the other's main bank. They were very creative in their responses. So 4 of the lessons learned, we kind of categorized them. The high capability teams really cared about attribution. So the yellow and blue, who had the most to lose because they're the most dependent, really were concerned with, well, what if the other teams find out it was us who were doing this? They were trying to keep their moves a little more secret and anonymous because they feared greater response and if their moves were attributed to them. The orange and red teams had a little less to lose, and so they were like, if it's attributed to us, it is, but we're going to do it anyways. We have less to lose here. And that I can see being completely happening in a real life situation. People with less to lose take greater risks, and that happened in space as well. Resiliency again came into play. Teams worked around these attacks. When one would lose an imagery satellite, they would go to their allies or commercial things. So kind of commercial companies proving what we had already deduced in our analysis from the report. Thresholds, like I said, they were really reluctant to use kinetic attacks in space, besides that one instance at the very end in the very last scenario. Cyber attacks were surprisingly used a lot more frequently than I think anybody on the study team thought. It was a very easy, quick response. Could do a lot of damage. It could be anonymous. And teams used it very early on in the scenarios and then very often as well. Lastly, asymmetries. They struggled to distinguish between the strategic and tactical systems. So this is like the C2 question. The command and control is a more strategic system in that it controls your nuclear weapons, and it's a grander strategy. Tactical might be your imagery satellite or your communications or GPS satellites. And we thought that teams were going to really care about the difference between those and think before they attacked. And as we saw, they really didn't. They wanted to attack what was going to be most beneficial to them in their cost-benefit analysis. So these are the findings of the whole report, taking in our study, our threat matrix that Thomas went through with you, and then also what we learned in the tabletop exercise. One thing I forgot to mention about the tabletop exercise, which is very cool, we published everything that we used. We published all of the background materials, the capabilities. It's all free to grab off our website and use in your own research. And we had an email this morning from the Air Force Academy, where a professor is going to use our study in his sophomore cadet class, which is pretty cool. And we hope to hear how his results compared to ours. So we think these are findings generally, but especially because we care about U.S. space policy. So the United States especially should invest in attribution. It's very important to know who is attacking you so you can respond in kind and you can make those deterrence calculations and communicate, especially for non-kinetic attacks, which are hard to trace. You can see where a missile is coming from. You can see when China launches something. You cannot, the space attack weapons are mobile. Some are mobile. You can have a laser in a different country, blind a satellite that's operated by anybody. So not only could it be a non-state actor, but it could be a state in a different country conducting operations and really creating a lot of tension there through that. So we think that the United States should particularly pay attention to investing in attribution capabilities.
We also recommended that the United States increase its resiliency in space, and that's a couple of the things that Kaitlyn was mentioning. If there were an attack, to be able to not just respond, but sort of rebuild the capabilities that asset possessed for the United States and the benefits it gave to its partners. And so that means if it's a satellite constellation, having another satellite on deck in orbit ready to take over that place. Or it could be the strategy Kaitlyn mentioned earlier, where instead of having a large satellite bus with an array of capabilities, spreading those assets across several satellites, so if one were to be attacked, the entire system wouldn't go down.
Policymakers also need to re-examine reversibility. We found in our tabletop exercise, which surprised us from our original report, that countries being attacked did not perceive reversible attacks as any less threatening than a non-reversible attack. And we were a bit surprised by that because, if you lose contact with your satellite for a few hours and then you get it back, it's obviously much better than losing it completely. But the teams in the scenario were moving so fast to make decisions and posture themselves that did not calm their fears that they were going to get it back, maybe. They reacted as if they had completely lost it. So maybe re-examining how we deal with reversibility and where those thresholds are when a reversible attack happens.
Identifying when escalation happens. A unique challenge we faced in the Wargame we provided to our space experts at CSIS is that it's not always clear when an adversary is escalating vertically. If we don't have norms of behavior internationally agreed upon, a code of conduct for space players, we don't know what normal behavior is, so we don't know what abnormal behavior is. We don't know what the indicators are for what's a potential threat and what's signaling warmongering or war behavior.
Demonstrating capabilities, again, to successfully deter, you have to have successful communications. This is especially hard in space because a lot of satellites are highly classified, and countries do not want to disclose what capabilities they have or how serious or how technical their capabilities really are. And so to be able to credibly communicate and to communicate successfully without sharing all of the information, that that's a hard thing for our policymakers to have to kind of work around, and definitely takes some more thought.
And our last finding and recommendation is to build coalitions and strengthen the ones that are already there. I think this is an interesting time because we actually in the news see the coalitions we have enhancing our ability to detect aggressive behavior. So in North Korea and in the Sea of Japan, we have partners, we have allies who are sharing their data with us. And if we continue to do that with more areas around the world, we'll be able to attribute better. We'll be able to recognize when escalation occurs, and sort of building those relationships and strengthening the ones that are already there will be critical to identifying escalation and our other findings along these lines for our report.
So that's it. If you would like to read our study, it's online at csis.org. It's not too long if you don't include all the background materials at the very end. It's about 40 pages. It goes into much more depth on the threat matrix, the first chart Thomas showed on launch by country, and of course on deterrence theory itself, and how the scenarios ended up playing out. So we're open to questions if you have them. Yes.
I have a couple. First of all, what size laser are you talking about?
Sorry.
Could you repeat that question?
Yes. What size laser would you be talking about for either dazzling or degrading a satellite?
So to dazzle or blind a satellite needs to be within the radius of the laser in question. So it's about how far the satellite is away, because of course a laser's radius changes by distance, but also it's the main measure of whether or not a laser on the ground is capable of completing the task is its power. So it's a traditional measure of power. But an interesting point that you did not raise, but is related to what you said, is the power of a laser can change based on where it is. Lasers on the ground must travel through Earth's atmosphere to dazzle or to blind a satellite, and that's a ton of air, and it can aberrate the signal. It can change the direction of where you're trying to point your laser, and it can present a number of complications for what you're trying to do. And so a laser in space will be much more capable of completing the task at hand. And so that'd be electronic warfare. That's one of the space threats we identified in the second chapter.
Others?
Yes, because you said that one country might put a laser in use it in another country's territory. And I was just wondering whether that would be feasible or not, given the necessary size of a laser.
Oh yes, it's. I mean, I'm not sure of the weight or size of this kind of thing, but the mobility is absolutely feasible. We're losing track of this. Maybe you can shout your question.
The answer is it depends.
Absolutely.
I was involved in GBL ASAC, ground-based laser anti-satellite weapon design early in my career. Can you go back to the third scenario? The question has to do with, you mentioned two satellites. One was going to go ahead and attack and run into the other one. So what assumptions did you make about the orbits of those two satellites, the orbital parameters?
Can you repeat your question one more time?
Yeah, those two satellites, you said one was going to smack into the other. Mm-hmm. So what assumptions did you make about the orbital elements of those two satellites?
So, I mean, a lot of these satellites are in circular orbit, so they have to be at the same altitude for them to collide. The most likely place of collision is along the equator, and with there's one major catalog of where satellites are, where their orbital parameters are published. So you can, using those, they publish the timestamp for when those orbital parameters were measured. You can predict where satellites will go. So you can predict a collision I mean, this is, we're mixing real world scenarios and hypothetical world scenarios, but if the United States or one of its allies were to have a satellite that was nearing collision, they would have been alerted beforehand, no matter where it's coming from. That's true for elliptical orbits as well, but in this particular scenario, it'd be circular orbits. We
had the white cell or the white team who took all the moves and first evaluated if they were possible, and then also kind of rolled the dice based on different levels of how do you explain that?
So so in a real world scenario, the likeliness of attack is if you were to suppose launch a direct ascent ASAT, there's a chance you could miss. It's hard to measure that sort of a chance, but it's certainly not 100% possible to hit. It's 100% possible, 100% likely to hit a satellite upon attempting, and that's true across the spectrum of space threats in that matrix we presented earlier. And so we wanted to include that in our space game, sort of have a dice rolling after a move was made to see if that event actually occurred. But then we did it across the board, whether the event was attributable, whether the event was reversible, and in a couple of other scenarios as well. And we used unclassified open source materials to sort of establish what those probabilities should be, and we published them in our appendix.
So I think what's notable about this was that the yellow team was the most capable, so they had the highest probability of success for almost everything across the board. So it was their satellites that were maneuvered in and damaged the other teams. If it had been a different team, maybe trying to make the same move, there could have been a less probability that it would have occurred, and it rolled the dice and it would not have happened. But again, it's a hypothetical situation to test more the theory of it. Oh, I can, of the professor? We can pull it up on our phone. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, my other question was the non-proliferation in space. Is there any way to actually verify that? So that some country like North Korea, who didn't care about international norms?
No. Which is kind of terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of layers of that. So the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prevents, and that includes North Korea as a signatory, all spacefaring nations are signatories. That prevents, as Kaitlyn said, hosting, and that means putting a nuclear weapon in orbit. But there's also another treaty, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which followed the United States testing a nuclear weapon in low Earth, at an altitude of low Earth orbit, but not in low Earth orbit. And North Korea and China were not signatories of that treaty. So no, there's no way to verify whether this happens, but also not all actors are signatories in these agreements.
Looking at the concept of resilience, why is it that the U.S. launches these large, juicy target satellites? Is it more of a cost analysis perspective, a practicality perspective, that initially when these were launched, it wasn't assumed that they would be targets?
There are a couple of different ways to approach that question. Maybe I'll give it a shot, and if you have anything to add, you can. If you look at the way that launch systems have been developed over time, their ability to launch mass has increased. And if you look at the major players of how American systems are launched to space now, they are more capable than they've ever been before. And so when the United States is capable of creating the largest satellite in the world, they typically do. There's a strong pattern for that.
I would also say that as satellite technology has shrunk, with small sats and diversified with microsats, the United States government has not necessarily taken that and then diversified their larger capabilities onto smaller satellites. So it's still the trend. It's what they know how to do. They do it well to create these large bus satellites that may host multiple capabilities. So we're suggesting maybe they think about diversifying them to increase their resiliency. Okay. Well, thank you guys.
We're happy to chat afterwards as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.